Hey listeners, we are back with another episode. This time, we are going to talk about zero knowledge proofs in the context of identity. We trace through the history of identity on the internet starting from Web 1 era of username and passwords all the way to the upcoming privacy preserving zero knowledge credentials. We dig into specific projects such as Sismo, zkPassport, World, and others. Thanks for tuning in today. Give us a like if you enjoyed this episode and share it with someone who might like it. Now let's dive in.
Yeah, I guess the thought was to kind of go through origins of identity, particularly, I guess, focus on online digital identity, like go into some of the things that work, don't work as we go through that, and then where things are headed and people that are working on the problems, like design space essentially now.
To set the table, like maybe we can run through the history of identity, like as it was in different eras of web, right? Web 1, Web 2, Web 3, and the era prior to Web 1. The concept of identity is fascinating. It's probably as old as humans because when you have humans, you probably need the notion to identify them. So maybe even the first name and last name is your identity in a way. I don't know if Paleolithic people had first name or last name. Probably they didn't. They used some other way of identifying. They definitely didn't have driver's license. But like this is the whole concept of identifying someone. It's a fascinating concept. And I think for a long time, like until I think it's the year 1991 was the year when people started onboarding to internet, because prior to that, internet was only available to the universities and big institutions. And before that, people had only this notion of identity, which is from their real life, right? They had the driver's license, they had the passports, and this is issued by the government of their country. And that's how their their life was pretty okay without the internet, right? They could do everything, like they could work at their job and like do grocery shopping or whatever, travel internationally with passport. But then once the internet came around, the people almost has like these two, like almost like a parallel life, right? Like they have this life rooted in the physical space where they are going to school or going to work and have like some notion of identity there, and then maybe after they come home and then they're browsing like forums in the web 1 era, let's say, and like Reddit in the web 2 era, or like buying shitcoins in web 3 era. So like all this to say is like yeah, identity is like a super complicated topic. And one thing I always find interesting is cryptography has always been instrumental in solving identity related issues. So, for instance, elliptic curve cryptography, one of the main applications was signatures. And why would you build signatures? Because in order to identify someone, even before the internet, if you look at the old cryptography papers, like during the time of Diffie-Hellman and RSA and all those people, they were always writing to solve these problems of identity and authorization and who has credentials to what. And I think what they were hoping for, that their ideas borrowed by corporations, by governments for access management and these kind of stuff. But that happened, but also all those ideas were then taken to the internet and used there as well. Um, I think Web 1 era was pretty interesting. It was like when I think there wasn't any big internet players, like there wasn't like Google or Facebook. There was Yahoo at the time. I don't know if you remember Yahoo chats, like I do recall Yahoo Messenger for sure.
I can't say I spent any time on Yahoo chats if that dates me. Yahoo was definitely very present as a whole. I guess going back to the Web 1, what the interaction looked like for someone, where it was almost early on, it's purely a novelty. And it's just, the audience that can use it is either like privileged in the sense that like, hey, we can only have certain amount of servers that can connect to like universities, the 6 original servers that I guess would have started eventually what turns into broader like World Wide Web, or you're like highly technical, where you figure out a way to host your own server and you're able to published data. And I guess, yeah, that kind of creates this read where there's no large scale idea that you're going to need a form of identity outside of what we were talking about on, some simple username, password, potentially for some sort of authorized site or credentials. And on that point of credentials, it's interesting with the cryptography kind of underlying a lot of the advances for identity, because it helps us replicate the properties of the physical world in the digital one. Can't, fake a lot of things that are in the real world, like, individuals or, I guess you typically would use the fingerprint example, every fingerprint being unique. And maybe some later players that we talk about have different thoughts on what uniqueness actually qualifies as. There's that constant of largely it was issued through large organizations, governments, and that was trustworthy. And then when you go online and anyone can have numerous amounts of identities, then you're going to need some form of verifiability. Cryptography and signatures is a great problem space that somehow they figured out a way to crack and be able to start to scale identity online, which is interesting, like that parallel between uniqueness essentially or authenticity or provenance that we now get with signatures.
Yeah, I think in the early days, like in the web, when there were people hosting these forums and other people could either read it and don't post it at all. In that case, they don't need an identity. But if they want to post like a comment, then they need to register as a user. And what they would typically get is a username and a password. And the servers would typically store the hashes of that password. So cryptography was used there as well, just like very basic hashing of password, MD5 or something in that era, or even like SHA-1, I don't remember. Cryptography was instrumental in that era. But then as it was also a bit exhaustive for people to keep track of all these anonymous commenters who could write really anything, but then you cannot really prove that maybe what they wrote actually has some real world backing around it, or they just made some facts up and now there's this big pile of misinformation that you're reading on forums. And I think later when like Facebook came around, like in early 2000s, 2004, 2005, I think 2004 when it launched, it was only for college students. But then one thing they make sure is people who are onboarding through Facebook are like real people and not just anybody playing anyone else on the internet. So their people's identity got tied up with their real identity somehow, although they were not requiring KYC or anything, but just the fact that you could only use Facebook if you're a student of Harvard initially, and then they rolled out to Stanford and like other universities, already kind of established this notion of trust and verifiability through this web of trust, that the only person on this platform is a person who went through college. So it's not just anyone spreading misinformation on the Web1 style forums. And I think around that time, the notion of identity started to centralize a little bit. Like we started seeing this single sign-ons kind of products. Like smaller websites started to use the OAuth frameworks from Google and Facebook, and what they would do is like have a button on their website. Instead of implementing their own login system, they will create this sign in with Facebook or sign in with Google. And what you do is you click on that button, you will be redirected to a Facebook pop-up, and there you will log in with your Facebook credentials, and Facebook will send like an OAuth token to that other website server. The other website is basically kind of outsourcing this whole access control identity management to like this big entity called Facebook or Google, who now has the capacity to do all this identity management for everyone else. And the whole Web 2 era, most smaller companies who are not as big as Google or Facebook kind of always outsource their identity verification management work to these companies and everything, and like all the user information ended up being centralized in just a couple of databases. And obviously that creates this honeypot of data. Somebody could steal that data. And yeah, all these identity related, privacy related problems that everybody talks about endlessly.
Yeah, so what you're bringing up is sort of the transition from purely, largely like limited interactions. The value of online identity was less so than physical for people prior to the internet, but even early internet. And then social network starts like that whole concept of, I guess, MySpace is like the Facebooks of the world are starting to create this mirrored but slightly detached life between what you do in the physical world, what you do in the online world. And in the example of Facebook at their early stages, the credential is still their email address, which is issued by Harvard. So that's like, hey, trusting that Harvard's only giving it to students, I'm pretty sure you're going to be a person that also is in the same school as me. That's relatively an easy bet at the time to make. So it's an interesting kind of evolution that also seems probably the catalyst for more robust identity, is that people are doing different types of things. I guess social network is one, but then you're starting to have what you brought up, like the centralizing factor, is that no one really wants to host a web server. Like the average person, to be able to host all the services that they want to be able to run and interact with services, the great part of the internet is that it is hosted somewhere else, in the sense that you get to tap into the services that are really hard to build, and you get exposed to them just through websites versus having the hardware and software all running that you have to run yourself. So for mass scale adoption, it makes it a lot easier if you're able to just log on, maybe use some reoccurring logon, this sort of like federated or social logon that we start to see between, I guess, probably Facebook, maybe Google. Now you've got Amazon, you've got Apple, you got everyone wants identity to run through their rails, but also other functions. So I think that we've talked about the social side. There's also probably other services, like banking, right? They probably need some form of secure logon that you're going to have. And I wonder at what point, majority of banks actually had a secure logon at some point. So now we have other people that are hosting businesses that are hosting services, and it's kind of scaled. What are some of the things you mentioned that the trade-offs that are happening here for users? You mentioned honeypots. I guess that's a double-edged sword for both user and companies, but anything else that comes to mind?
Yeah, the convenience factor is huge, right? As you mentioned, in the Web 1 era, when there were no Facebooks or Googles or Amazons or Apples, and every forum or every service that you're using is doing their own identity management, then you have to remember hundreds of passwords or something, which username, which password that you use to sign in these services if you're trying to log back in. So inconvenient, but also it was insecure, I believe. There were a lot of phishing attacks where somebody will send you a link to a website that looks like the forum that you know, but it's different, and then you might get phished. So it was inconvenient, it was insecure. Facebook identity everywhere, and that was convenient, that was secure, but that creates this centralized database of all the identities at one place. And like if somebody were to conduct a massive hack, they could steal everything, and users' identity could be stolen, and which might later be used for identity thefts and all sorts of scams. That was a big downside, I would say, of the Web 2 era of identity. But then around, when did one come around? 2009 or something like that?
I'll throw out maybe one other thing around on the pros is that convenience is also, there's some sort of rewards or identity aggregation that you can start to get. So you can build up consistent identity in a better way that's less fragmented than individual forums where maybe Reddit's a perfect example of using the forum example from Web 1, where maybe you're participating in single forums, and instead Reddit is this marketplace or forum of forums where you have a bunch of different forums that within each you can gain additional karma, and you're not isolating identity to one individual part. Instead, it's like the sum of it. So you're getting this trade-off of anonymity to, sort of reputation, kind of what you're talking about on the same side of before there was just anonymity, and maybe you could build up like reputation within one particular forum, but now you're starting to get this ability to like sum across other experiences online.
And also, like, there's a notion of provenance, right? When it comes to Reddit, like, if you start a new account and you start accumulating karma, then you can basically trace back your old post and see which post and which forum gave you what karma. So there's this notion about, like, okay, where is this account came from? Like, when did it start? Which forum did it post? And, like, how this user evolved over time. So you could trace back the history of like user interaction through that one Reddit identity.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, it's a big factor. It's having some history, be able to trust, and then I think that brings into what you were talking about.
Yeah, with blockchains, it's interesting, right? Because with blockchains, you get this notion of self-sovereign identity, that you control your identity because you control your key, right? It's now up to the user to safeguard their private keys. By signing anything with that private key, you would be able to prove your identity. The PKI, public key infrastructure, and the public key cryptography, all of that predates Web 2 era, I believe. It was invented way before that, right? In the 70s, 80s, or something like that. But it's really hard to set up, like, without blockchains, it's really hard to set up this whole public key infrastructure because people didn't have access to wallets, and blockchains or the crypto culture in general, the Web3 applications, Coinbase, markets, they kind of gave a lot of people, I don't know, maybe millions, hundreds of millions of people at this point now have these wallets, and wallets are just key pairs. So it kind of bootstrapped this network of private keys where nobody had the private key and nobody had their own key pairs. Only if you're technically sophisticated, you might generate a key pair and use a software like GPG or PGP and then encrypt your files and things like that. But like nowadays, like if you're now today, you could basically download a wallet, like a Rainbow wallet or an app store, and you have access to public-private key pair, which you can use for encryption, which you can use for signing arbitrary stuff, using sign-in with Ethereum and use your Ethereum address as an identity. So I think that's pretty interesting that even though public key cryptography existed way before Web2 forums, it wasn't really adopted, but it really took this whole blockchains and Web3 to come into picture so that everybody could have access to the key pairs so that we could use these key pairs as a form of self-sovereign identity.
Yeah. And I wonder if one of the big pieces of that is now there is an incentive around it, right? We didn't even touch on email on Web 2, but I guess largely Web 2. Email is a pretty big form of identity, and you're able to address people, interact, send messages. That's a pretty massive breakthrough. And then on the key pairs side of things, now addresses are these unique identifiers, but actually guaranteed to be unique thanks to everyone that's put in a lot of work on the cryptography under the hood. The fact that now you have some incentive, like I don't know if anyone wants private key pair for private key pair sake, but instead it's a means to an end, and in this case an address is a way to interact and participate in the system. And I'd bring up also, it's not just blockchains that are part of the self-sovereign identity or decentralized identity as a whole. You have blockchains and then decentralized identifiers like DIDs and verifiable credentials, which are standards by the W3C, which can or don't have to leverage blockchains as well. I know there's work being done on more than one way to have decentralized identity. in the
Yeah,
wild.
that's a good point.
And how would you define self-sovereign identity for someone that is hearing that for the first time?
Yeah, before that, like, I just want to comment one additional thing about that incentive thing. Like, it reminds me, like, of PayPal. One of the important thing in PayPal's growth at the time was that if you invite someone, they would basically give $10 to you and $10 to someone who has just joined the network. And that kind of acted as a solution to the cold start problem, because you can associate that $10 with a new email which hasn't signed up on the system. And once they sign up, they get that $10. So a lot of people signed up, put their email with PayPal, and then that's how, like, the network got started, like this kind of, user to user network where they could send money through the PayPal network. And it's almost similar, like, with blockchains as well, right? Like, if you could airdrop someone like some money in a wallet and then they can later claim it, I think that's also kind of an incentive for someone to create that public private key pair just to claim whatever, like $50 airdrop or something like that. So that's also like one parallel between Web 2 and Web 3. And then, like, you started talking about self-sovereign identity. I guess it's like it's really a mouthful, but I think like sovereign identity is like, I believe it's more about the custody of the identity. When you custody there's more to it. You have your passport, you have your driver's license, you can custody it. It's a piece of document, but it's issued by the government. It's not really self-sovereign, even though you custody it, because the root of trust exists not at the user. The root of the trust is the institution that issued the document. But I think self-sovereign identity, I would say, is like a proof of identity, which is not just you custody it, but you are actually the root of trust as well. So if anybody could generate like a ECDSA SecP 256K1 key pair and use it to sign any Ethereum transaction, and the Ethereum address acts as the identifier for this key pair, right? And so you custody the private key related to that key pair, and nobody actually signed anywhere, said that no government said that, okay, this is your private key, only you should use it. It's just your private key because you created it. So I think that's how I would describe self-sovereign identity, that you starts with you and you also custody it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that you used the example of physical identity or credentials that people interact with. There's this local, centralized to decentralized, and then self-sovereign is a subset of decentralized identity that has certain properties where I personally think it closer reflects the relationship of identity that you have in the physical world. It's inherently decentralized in the sense that decentralized and custodied for it to be self-sovereign, in the sense that you are the master of your own identity. You can decide who gets access to it, what is being actually accessed even within certain files or certain subsets of data, and you also have the ability to sort of disallow that. You can verify others that you interact with. So it puts it onto the user to both present, allow access, but also decide who else they trust as well. So what you said on that term of root of trust, it's like a kind of reflexive, what other people can trust, you get to decide, because you can opt into certain information requests, and then you can also remove that if you want. And then you also don't have to trust other people. You can check and verify their credentials on your own, because you have access to verifiable credentials or other forms of credentialing as a whole. So I like that mirror, where I think it just gets us closer to a lot of the abilities that we have in the physical world, as far as being present on certain forums. You can then decide and revoke, hey, no longer this is like my interest. You don't have any more access. It's not like, oh, you have those files, just up until when I stopped posting. It makes it user-centric, really. I think that's kind of what it is a part of as well, and as a stage in the internet, is it shifts to being user-centric rather than, I guess, corporate or whatever else it is. I think we're starting to generally shift towards that. And then there's benefits for maybe to go backwards even before, because self-sovereign identity is a even further away concept than where we are kind of today. I don't think there are ways that you can probably use and practice in a subset of services or online websites. You can do that, but largely like decentralized identity is the most immediate thing that you kind of have with, let's say an Ethereum address or a DID and like verifiable credential, because you also have to have people accept the identity and credentials for it to be useful, and we're starting to get there. And I think that for decentralized identity, pushing against now towards the pros and cons with decentralized or self-sovereign. One of the cons it requires a little bit more user knowledge and know-how in some cases, as far as, hey, if you have a public-private key pair, then maybe like a seed phrase as more like blockchain example. You don't really want to lose that. That also means that you lost your account. People are working to solve this problem, but that's a overhead that's put onto the average user that they probably don't want to have to store this and know that that's associated with now financials as well. And maybe they're like some sort of intermediary where you can have it and, hey, on my behalf, you can store this money, and you're going to be benevolent or kind and actually do the service that you agree to, which is allowing me to access my account through your services. So I think that's one of the trade-offs. The other benefit both for users and for businesses is that we're moving towards a regulated, like online data is becoming more recognized as an impact, and it's clearly recognized the amount of value that you can have. It's been long recognized as a lot of the differentiating factors that these social networks that you talked about for social login can have. It's valuable to get your moat of data, train the best models, serve the best ads, serve the best content, and have them play within your realm. But the trade-off is that you have it built on centralized databases, and that if there are leaks or new laws that are happening in different countries, you don't really have an easy way to follow them. Like GDPR being probably one of the first data laws that recognize user ownership and the relationship between users and their online data, where it kind of gave them property rights online, but also gave it specifically to European users' data. So if I was Facebook and have servers in Europe, I have to abide by these. So these are different rules that have to be abided by just within a certain jurisdiction. And that doesn't always go well. I think recently we saw 2 weeks ago, TikTok it might have been $60 million. It could have been a higher multiple. I don't know if it was higher than that, by Ireland, because they alleged to send data from Ireland to China servers, essentially, where ByteDance is based.
We move from this really convenient way of identity management where user doesn't have to do anything. They don't have to safeguard any important credential, any key pair, to a system which is less convenient, because now they have to safeguard. If we talk about self-sovereign identity, then like with sovereignty will also come a responsibility, and then now users have an additional responsibility of taking care of this key pair. And so we kind of, in this whole transition of Web 2 to Web 3, we kind of lost that convenience.
I think in the short term, probably self-sovereign identity in particular, I believe almost directly implies that, where it is meant to be more user empowering, human empowering the individual. So I do think decentralized identity doesn't necessarily have to have the complete trade-offs. Not everyone wants to be the one that fully custodies all of the assets.
Yeah.
And it's, as we've seen for every other large responsibility, people like to delegate that to others that are more fit to do so than themselves. So there's probably going to be some trade-off, maybe some separation of types of activities. I'm not going to delegate maybe my Twitter access to other people just because that's more of a personal representation of, thoughts or whatever. But maybe financials, maybe you don't want to fully custody. Maybe you do want to fully custody. I think it more now starts to give optionality, and we'll probably have abstractions that are built on top of decentralized rails. And maybe it's something that for the average user, they just don't realize. I think that's my broader hope with a lot of the things with crypto, is that there's probably a large portion of population that doesn't want to, or the overhead isn't worth knowing what's going on under the hood. And then if you want to know, you can know, and you can do some pretty cool stuff with it.
Yeah, it's almost like Zooko's triangle, if you're familiar with that term.
I'm not. Yeah.
It's kind of it's very similar to the scalability trilemma that we talk a lot about in crypto. The three sides of triangle: decentralization, security, and scalability, where you cannot get all three, but then you somehow try to balance 2 out of 3 or somehow get 3 out of 3, but compromise on each axis a little bit. And I think Zooko's triangle is named after Zooko, who is also the creator of Zcash, one of the original ZK project, first project to deploy zero knowledge cryptography in real world, 2016, 2015, around that time. And I think this triangle is like the 3 vertices of this triangle: decentralization, security, and human readable names. So it's really about identity, and you cannot get all 3 of these things, or at least you couldn't have previously, and now with blockchains you could do it. So if you think about the DNS system and how it centralizes because of the certificate authorities and the root certificate authority, which then signs the public key for the certificate authorities below them. So that's the whole DNS system. It's scalable. It gives you readable names like facebook.com or paypal.com. But then the cost is it's all centralized with these certificate authorities who issue certificates. The invention of blockchain, you kind of you can actually solve this dilemma. I think ENS now gives you all 3. Basically, you can have decentralization because that comes through underlying smart contracts as it is deployed on a decentralized blockchain. And then you can have human readable names like alice.eth or bob.eth. And you can also have security, that the names are unique. Alice cannot act as if she holds the keys for bob.eth or something like that.
Thank you, ENS, for that, amongst others. I guess that kind of brings us into some of you mentioned Zcash there. Talk about ZK and identity. The immediate thought is the privacy preserving aspects of it. I guess inherently, if you're doing, I guess
that was big. That was also a trade-off in the identity solution that we got in Web3, right? We got a convenience trade-off that it is slightly less convenient, but it was self-sovereign. But also, the blockchain addresses, like your Ethereum address or something, they're all public. So you can trace my transaction history. I can trace your transaction history because our identities are basically just hashes of our public keys. So there's no privacy, there's no convenience, but we are self-sovereign. I think the logical next step with ZK should be to get back that privacy, because even in the Web2 era, which created this centralized honeypots of data, it is somewhat private, right? Not everybody could see everybody else's user information. Like even if my birth date and my address is on Facebook server, but like you cannot see it. So it's private, and all Facebook could see it, and like every other person cannot see it. It's like semi-private there. But then in blockchains, it's not even semi-private. The whole history, the identity is public, and you can trace all the transactions. So it's totally transparent.
I think Aztec would like to have something to say for that.
Yeah.
There's two things you brought up there. One, which is privacy, where that you do get anonymity, but not necessarily privacy of underlying what's actually happening and what you're doing, where in Web 2 even you can kind of flip a switch and you can decide whether or not something is public or private, using the example of maybe a Venmo in the US, just like public or private transfers, and that just means who do you reveal it to. If I decided to reveal it, public, everyone can see that. That includes like Venmo. If I decided to Venmo you and have private on it, it's us, and then PayPal, or not PayPal, but Venmo is also in the loop and checking it out. But now anyone could, see, let's say on base Ethereum, just public transactions. And then, we've been having people working hard on how do you have privacy preserving like blockchain. And Aztec is now live as well, which is pretty exciting. So there's some interesting things going on. I've been seeing different related privacy projects. I've been seeing some stuff related to privacy pools and things like that, or like Railgun and others. So the other piece you brought up beyond just privacy is sort of kind of like fragmentation, roughly, on identity, where you do get this trade-off. Sweet, you can be anonymous, but you don't get the accrued social reputation to a singular identity. So it's this weird trade-off again between reputation and like privacy from before. And that kind of brings us into, there's a couple of different ways that people are working on privacy and thinking about it. There's a whole realm of things that exist solely in the physical world, as far as credentials, like passport, driver's license, and identity, and bridging that gap. And then there's a whole other world that's bridging more digital native sort of identity. And curious how you're seeing that, as we have different people applying similar technologies, but in different manners.
ZK kind of became a reality after 2020 or around that time, because before that, it was quite impractical. If you look at the kind of ZK proofs that Zcash used in 2016, it required like highly unscalable trusted setup ceremonies where they did some crazy thing in an airplane to get some entropy and generate keys, and like not anybody could do that.
I did not hear that. Wait, airplanes?
Yeah, they were like, people were going in forests with laptops and getting some entropy signals from some trees and then destroying the laptops so they cannot produce any trace. And all those things happened like during 2016 to 2020, but people improved on. I think Plonk was a big improvement because it created this notion of reusable trusted setup. And then Starks came around that time too, where you don't need a trusted setup. So the techniques in zero knowledge cryptography became more scalable for other projects to use. And I think maybe some of these projects, Sismo, we were talking about earlier, zkPassport, and some of those. I believe there was IDN3 back in the day, which I think later became Polygon ID. It was acquired by Polygon, I believe. And I think maybe at that point, people started to implement some of the lessons learned from the privacy transaction blockchains or privacy pools and bring it into the realm of identity.
Sismo, early project there, I guess. Essentially, the idea was, okay, you have these different, I believe the core concept with it was you have different accounts, and if you want to solve that problem of, I have fragmentation, I can now have many different wallets, like I can have many different accounts, but I want to link between them and prove that I am the same person that owns all of these, how do you do that in a privacy preserving way versus just being like, hey,
Yeah.
I own all of these. Everyone knows. You break the anonymity that you get from individual. You can kind of have separate online presences split between wallets or identifiers online. And now how do you prove that you're the same across them? So Sismo created open source. Eventually they wound down the actual project maybe 2023, and all open source, and we can use it. It's pretty awesome.
What I gather from Sismo is that they create this data vault for a user, and it's kind of a private data vault. You could import all your transaction history, and you could also import all your Web 2 stuff, I believe, and that only you have access to. If you want to log in to a service that uses Sismo as an authentication mechanism, you create a ZK proof from the data that you have in your private vault, and you can choose which parts you want to expose and keep the other parts hidden. And then you can generate a zero knowledge proof locally and then use that to send it to the service that you're trying to log in. And it could verify the proof and log you in, and it doesn't need to know everything that's in your data vault. So it kind of integrates all your identity, like all the activity associated with different identities. It merges everything together in this vault so you can generate the proofs easily, which is pretty effective. Sounds like a pretty good architecture to me.
Yeah, it seems that there's probably going to be, it's interesting as far as tech evolution goes, where someone will crack the code on something, either it gets adopted or it doesn't in the short term. And then over the long term, people they revisit the idea and then tweak it, improve it, maybe just directly use it, but now it's the right time and it works. It's like Zcash maybe as an example, and then Tornado Cash, which we didn't really talk about. It's also massive project within ZK and privacy preserving technology. And then, like Sismo, maybe I'm curious, there's probably some learnings that people actually have from that, whether people that directly worked on it or people that are going to use it in their own projects, as this idea of the data vault kind of similar to like the general wallet structure. There's even this project is it Jack from Dorsey? Was it Web5? They also had like the self-hosted node essentially. I forget exactly what the term was, but the idea is that everyone has their own node in the network that stores all their data. You can allow access to it.
Wait, isn't that Blue Sky ad protocol?
There is a different project.
Okay.
It was called Web5 out of, kind of tongue-in-cheek as far as the Web 2 to Web 3.
Yeah.
Now it's Web 5. But probably Blue Sky uses some similar sort of concept, but just more so touching on the idea that there's shared ideas that are being implemented behind the scenes. You have Data Vault for Sismo, like Disco, which is now Privado, and which is the data backpack, right? And that's an abstraction on top of DIDs, verifiable credentials. People are going to learn from previous implementations, tweak it, improve it, and hopefully it works and gets users.
Also, there are different approaches. Like for Sismo, it is aggregating online presence of a person through various identities. But then you have zkPassport, which is taking something from the real world, which is your passport, and it is issued by a government. So the root of trust is the government. And then what you do is you generate a zero knowledge proof locally on your device to prove that you have an address local to a country or you are beyond certain age, and you only prove that fact that you are beyond certain age. Let's say you're higher than 18 years old or higher than 21 years old if you're going to a bar or something or ordering alcohol online. So you could use your zkPassport to do that. There's another third approach, which is biometric, which is even more controversial. I don't know if you have scanned your eyeball recently by looking at the world orb, but Yeah, there are three different approaches. They're quite disjoint, and each one of them is quite interesting.
Yeah, the like, zkPassport itself does this as well. The privacy preserving physical credentials, where with a lot of passports, I think it's the NFC chip essentially that you're able to tap and do some data transfer, and then kind of extract, selectively disclose that information. I was gonna say, if we didn't talk about the classic example for ZK, which is driver's license. Hey, are you over under 21? That is it's a funny one that always gets revisited. So glad you touched on that. I think you could just even use your own phone because you have an NFC reader. Kind of getting into the idea of root of trust that you brought up, as far as, hey, I can generate this credential. It's not just me, also, though, that is actually, it's still back to a government issued credential, but now you can use it in whatever forum, whatever channel requests it. And then then there's like biometric, like world with the iris essentially uniquely identifying. There's also I'm gonna butcher the name, aren't I? But is it Adhar? Andhar in India?
Yeah,
Adhar. Do you know a little bit more about? I'm trying to think exactly what they use, because I don't think it was.
it's not zero knowledge.
It was not zero knowledge,
Yeah,
but it's maybe just related, like tangentially. I thought they would use some sort of like fingerprint or palm, maybe.
Yeah, I have an Aadhaar card, but I don't recall what was the exact process. I got it many years ago. And I think there's a fingerprint scan, and you attach it with your email, phone number, your home address. And it's really just a database, like how Facebook does it. Instead of Facebook, you have a country doing it. Whereas Worldcoin and other proof of humanity, once they are scanning the iris, which seems more Sybil resistant, right? Like you can, like the iris scan maybe has, it's just impossible to fake. If you have the iris scan of someone, you can uniquely identify that person through that fingerprint, and hopefully it doesn't leak, and hopefully it doesn't leave that ugly looking orb.
No, don't insult the orb. It can't defend itself.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see, the other, real quick, while we're talking about identity, Bhutan is actually a country that has self-sovereign identity for all of its population.
No. Yeah, and I believe there's something like a project going on in Argentina as well, in collaboration with ZKSync, where they issue the government identities, and you could create a zero knowledge proof with the attributes that you're willing to share. Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, I think Cork ID is working with Buenos Aires larger government. So that's also really, Argentina has a lot of great developments across the space beyond just identity related things, stable coins as well. I'm curious, maybe now, like reflecting on your own use of identity, any interesting, like recent uses of identity you've seen or you use day to day?
Well, I think I've used a sign-in with Ethereum quite a lot. Sign-in with Farcaster, had a few Farcaster-related apps, and sign-in with Ethereum in other Web3 apps. So that's one use of self-sovereign identity, I would say. The zero-knowledge one is interesting. A couple of episodes ago, we talked about an Oncast, which has now, unfortunately, it's not growing like it was at that time. But I still think it was pretty interesting phenomena at that point that you could send messages and basically broadcast messages by selectively revealing your identity and hiding all other things. So that was an interesting use case. And I hope those kinds of use cases would come up again.
You're not quite pricing your privacy because it's not exactly what it's doing, but you're deciding when tweet is good enough to reveal yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah, probably Farcaster, I would say, is maybe, signing with Ethereum, that's kind of wild that you could just connect to websites today and then you have instant ability to, like, constant relative like identity, like ENS under the hood.
Yeah.
I'm not typing up my address. I'm just typing in an identifier for my address. And then Farcaster is also probably a pretty easy one now with some of the cool apps that people are building or random ones. Yeah. Also, we didn't really mention any of the wallets. I guess that's one thing that I'm curious to see trends as far as it's the bridge between Web 2 and Web 3 identity, is that, hey, you don't actually have to go through and create like the wallet where it's all on the user. Just sign in with the email, sign in with the phone number, here's a wallet, you can interact and you get the same privileges to be able to interact with the service as anyone else. I think that's pretty awesome.
Recently, like wallets have started to integrate with social features. So Farcaster now has like a wallet in their app, and Coinbase Wallet has started to integrate Farcaster feed in their wallet. So like the wallets are starting to have some social functionalities, and social apps starting to have wallets.
Yeah. Come a long way since just online forums. I'm very curious to see where the intersection goes between social identity, money identity, public and private, how that sort of plays out. So not dull for sure. It feels rapidly innovating. Like you mentioned, not that long ago that those papers were first written and now been implemented, and then now you've got Honk as well, right? So you're even getting optimizations
I think Plonk was 2019 or something.
Yeah, so these things are moving pretty quickly. People are sharing ideas from others and capitalizing in the sense that it's compounding. I think it's a cool piece about what we were talking about on the last aspect on decentralized identity overall, is that these protocols are almost open by default typically. You can learn from the mistakes of others, you can learn from the successes of others and build something that's stronger, better. Anything else to share on the identity side?
No, I think that's pretty good. Like we started with giving a brief history of identity on the internet, how Facebook got started, and all the different ways cryptography was instrumental in basically every era of the web, like Web 1, Web 2, Web 3, to enable access control, access management, authorization, authentication, flows in web services. And then we covered different products. You mentioned zkPassport, Sismo, and various other things, country projects, Aadhaar, the Buenos Aires one, Cork ID. Yeah, I think we covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, I think that calls it a wrap for...
Yeah, that's a wrap. Give us a like if you enjoyed this episode, or drop a comment below to let us know your thoughts. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Until next time.